I'm Jim Murley. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer with Miami-Dade County, and I'm privileged to be moderating this panel. The Jason, Robert, and Lauren's extensive bios have been handed out. They're all involved in doing work in our region. And I think it's important for us to have a panel of representatives from the private sector, the consultants that almost all of us in our capacities rely on in one way or another to implement some of the guidance. They're often the groups that have to seal the information, sign and seal, and put their professional credibility on the work of which we're trying to influence through some of the information you've been listening to this morning. So we're going to let each one of them set up and go for about 10 minutes or so and take some questions and have some closing remarks, and then Steve and Michael are going to do the closeout, as I understand it. So, Jason, you're going to go up first?
I'm going to do it from here.
You're going to do it from there? Okay, guys, you can do it from here or go down there. Okay, Jason Bird with AECOM.
Thank you, Jim. And so as we're all adapting in our own ways for various communities and clientele, we're looking at the best approaches and learning from each other to ensure that we're moving forward together and adapting lessons learned from past experiences. Today I'm going to talk about our work on Miami Beach and the advancement that they're making as a resilient community. Just a quick overview. Obviously, we're all familiar with the challenges. I won't spend much time on that. It starts with city leadership. We'll talk a little bit about the work that came out of the city leadership commitments and action items, the flood mitigation program, resilience program, and next steps. Very quickly, we all recognize that the conditions and the data we see from the past are not necessarily the same we're going to see in the future. The projections have done a good job of capturing that and understanding conditions are changing. Intensity, severity, frequency is happening, and really thinking about what that means as it relates to moving forward in decision making. With the mayor's commitment and the city commission, they've developed a blue ribbon panel, which is intent on bringing some experts together and understand how to bring the city together collectively and talk about some tough issues and some tough questions surrounding adaptation to flood impacts. And that has led to various action items, including the flood mitigation work as well as the resilience work. Some of the discussion has already covered some of the flood mitigation work ongoing in Miami Beach, but just a quick overview. Streets are in the process of being elevated. Much of the investment that's currently happening is based on the highest priority areas, those most vulnerable, and streets are being elevated upwards of 2 feet. And an understanding of the implications of that change on private properties, on the connectivity, a variety of things has been thought through and carefully incorporated into those adaptation projects. Obviously, we've talked a lot about pumping and various other seawall enhancement projects. On the resilience program, this came out of the work from the flood mitigation, really recognizing that a much deeper dive was necessary to understand the implications of the work being done and how to look at longer-term protection of various assets in addition to the work as part of the flood mitigation program. Really, it was identified in 3 phases, starting with the code review, and the understanding that through the CIP program, through the various investment and initiatives, and the increase in development activity, that we needed to be proactive and really guide those investments through enhanced codes. And so the first phase included a review of various codes, land development regulations, various city policies to enhance that, develop freeboard requirements, a variety of other changes to those codes, many of which have been already codified. Others are in the process. Phase 2 really covers the vulnerability of assets with a deeper dive and understanding of the adaptive capacity, the sensitivity, and the impacts from sea level rise. Phase 3 really is, in the future, it will be development of adaptation strategies and a selection criteria, methodology for prioritizing those projects. Just a quick touch on the program, looking at the code changes and understanding existing versus proposed and what the implications are for private developers and owners. Very important part of working with the Blue Ribbon Panel and other city departments to ensure that the solutions adopted were positive and were any potential negative impacts were addressed through other code enhancements and through guidance documents. In order to develop recommendations within the codes, including freeboard, we looked at various hazard scenarios, starting with the compact, of course, adapting it to NAVD, which is a normalized datum for public improvement projects, looking at a variety of titled datums in order to understand from a design standpoint with your average daily high tides, your average monthly high tides, and annual high tides, the king tide, what the implications of sea level rise will look like based on the design criteria for those projects. A quick comparison of existing versus proposed of a couple of key development code enhancements that have occurred really show the difference in those policies with the additional 1 foot of freeboard added for single-family homes as well as commercial properties. A look at, there's also seawall elevations and other comparative tables that really helped inform the policymakers, the general public, and various stakeholders to understand what the implications are. In concert with this, various graphics, including inundation maps, are being produced to help inform those so we can educate the public and ensure that everyone has the best information available to make decisions on their properties. And this particular table also shows a comparison to the level of protection in a still water condition with sea level rise as well as with king tide on top of that. And finally, the next steps really are completing the vulnerability assessment, understanding the implications of various city assets, as well as moving into the public realm in the future, understanding the economics of climate change, the exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity of those, really taking a tried and true framework and applying this process accordingly to ensure investment is properly performed, and thinking about it in terms of triple bottom line or smart decision making tools and integrated system approach. So that's really in essence of where the city's headed and the type of thinking that will be considered as they move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roberts with Hazen Sawyer.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the chance to be here today. And go to get the presentation up. There it is. Thank you. As I started thinking about today and some of the lessons learned over the course of time working with the integration of sea level rise planning and resilience programs, got me thinking about the fact that oh, I'm sorry. I'll start again. Anyway, as I started thinking about today and what we might talk about, it gave me a little bit of pause to think about the fact that a number of folks that have been dealing with this issue of planning for sea level rise and integration into resilience programs have been at this a while. Thinking about a couple of entities that we've followed and worked with over the years. New York City DEP, who's been looking at climate change and the impacts on their infrastructure now for going on close to a decade. Certainly Florida, a leader in this area. The compact, thinking about the fact, and a little bit startling to think that 2009 was the development of the compact, and a lot of water under the bridge and sometimes a little water over the seawalls in that time period. But with the initial projections, the updated projections last year, the ongoing great work done, even events like today, there has been a lot of work and a lot learned, I think, that we can take advantage of. One of the things that I think is really important is the fact that learning is a process. We are not going to wake up one day and find out we've gotten there. We are going to have to be continuously learning and applying that incremental knowledge that we gain as we see conditions in our environment change. And that affects our policy making, the approach that we take to technical analyses, how we come up with solutions, how we invest our resources and our capital, how we communicate with our public, and how we cooperate and collaborate as a community trying to deal with resiliency. Talking about policy and code making, we'd have to make sure that we are anticipating the uncertainty of the future conditions that we're likely to see. And some of the things that we know now that we have to think about are time horizons. What will our projects look like, development and redevelopment? When will they start? When will they end? What are the useful life of those assets and infrastructure that we will be investing in? And have we adequately taken into consideration the best available information regarding future conditions when we look at whether or not we are making pragmatic decisions about those investments? If we are not doing those things, as was indicated earlier today, we are putting new assets at risk daily. We had a great explanation this morning about how we came to the projections, some great information in the Q&A that talked about the probabilities of reality falling on one side or the other of the different curves. There's no doubt if we had to try to pick a point and say that's it, we will probably not get it right. But we shouldn't be thwarted in that. We need to make sure that we have taken into consideration the appropriate conservatism, which you heard about relative to the curves this morning. And we need to make sure that we're implementing solutions that are flexible and will absorb some of the imperfection in our ability to know exactly what will happen and when. What we can't have happen is to be paralyzed by not knowing exactly what the answer will be in the future. No action is not an acceptable answer. Why is it so important for us to make these good decisions and take these steps going forward so that we don't put new assets and areas at risk? Well, I think as we've all seen, we have plenty of problem areas and plenty of at-risk areas already. It's going to take a lot of our energy, our resources, our finances to deal with those. Let's not create some additional problems. As I said, we're learning daily. This is an evolving process. Adaptation is a process. I think a few simple things that we can all hopefully ascribe to is getting started early, whether that's planning and putting aside intellectual knowledge and planning financially, making sure that we are diligent and purposeful in our planning efforts. Again, we're not going to wake up tomorrow and the sea level has risen 2 feet. This is going to happen over time, and we need to deal with it as such. And then we need to invest wisely. Just as I said, there's not an answer that says we can't do anything or shouldn't do anything. It's also not a situation where we push all our chips to the center of the table and go all in right now. We need to be investing wisely. And to me, that means making right-timed decisions regarding our investment. Our solutions that we come up with, they need to be adaptable. They need to work with the infrastructure that is already in place. And they need to work and dovetail with improvements that may be implemented in the future as we continue to see conditions change and adapt accordingly. And by right time, they just mean, we want to make sure that we're making these investments not 2 decades before we need them. We want to make them in a timely fashion so that we are good stewards of the public's money and are investing it in a timely manner. There's no date, or there are no dates on the axis here, and it's a little bit purposeful in that I think we shouldn't get locked into specific dates and thinking we have to do things by certain times. As we talked about this morning, there is some probabilities as to when things will happen in time, and we should monitor conditions, we should evaluate them, and we should allow trends and conditions to help be a trigger as to when we move forward implementing certain decisions. In addition to the right timing of our implementation, our improvements, our policies and programs, they have to be coordinated and well integrated. And a lot like these baby sea turtles running to the ocean, we're not all going to get started in this at the same time. We're not all going to take exactly the same path. Some will beeline straight to the water. Others will do a little meandering along their way. Hopefully, as we get closer to the destination, we get there closer together. I think we can all agree that resiliency is something achieved best jointly, and it's good to see this group here working in that regard. To that end, and as was indicated this morning, independent solutions, I think we found, will be suboptimal. We need to push for regionalization. It's crucial. There needs to be a regional planning and design approach. We need to make sure that efforts are coordinated between sister governments, between local governments and regional agencies, that the public and the private work together in this endeavor. We need to make sure that there's cooperative innovation and application of what we find. And that means, again, that government and academia and private enterprise, engineering, contracting are all pulling in the same direction with regard to this. As is kind of indicated by the two pictures here, sea level rise doesn't care about your jurisdictional boundaries. It doesn't care about your property lines. We are in this together, and we need to deal with it as such. Pooling our efforts and resources, I think one of the things we found is that is going to be our best bet for having technically sound and economically affordable solutions. The projections by the compact is a great example. You've got jointly selected science. You had a working group that, as was mentioned this morning, worked diligently on that, and it's a great place to be. There's a lot of work that's starting to take place, a lot of technical data, models that are being created. We should learn from those. We should use those. We don't need to all recreate the wheel. Take advantage of that. And there will be much data collected going forward to help with the planning and design and construction. An example of that, we're working now with the city of Fort Lauderdale, collecting additional LiDAR data at high resolution that's going to be a big benefit to them in many ways. The last thing that I really want to touch on is the communications side of this and the importance of that. You could have an otherwise very solid program. If we don't communicate effectively with the public, we're going to create a lot of problems for ourselves. The king tides are kind of our friend, a little bit of a silver lining in that they give us a glimpse into what sea level rise might look like. But we are asking the public largely to fund and be a part of an unseen future condition. It's going to require trust and a shared vision. That's going to require a broad array of communication tools to get those points across. The use of visualization tools in that will be great. They're an excellent way of showing what we expect and looking at various scenarios at both broad scale and a much closer to home scale. Important for the public to understand the big picture, so we need to have a programmatic communications approach, having some branding that is noticeable by the public, a clear communications plan that lays out what the message is that we're trying to get across, who will provide that message, how it will be provided, when will it be provided. And at the same time, we're going to be implementing improvements within our communities, and we can't lose sight of the fact that we've got to be also connecting with the public in an intimate way where we're doing construction in their neighborhoods, and making sure that we don't lose sight of that portion of the communication. And I will wrap it up with just a few quick thoughts and hopefully a positive outlook. And the turnout today is great and I think speaks well to this, but I just thought that if we're proactive, cooperative, innovative, flexible in our thinking, and persistent, I have no doubt that we'll be resilient. And I think we all look forward to working together to make that a reality. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Lawrence is with CH2M. I always want to say Hill, but that's the old name. And Bertha kind of set up some of the work I know you've been doing in Miami-Dade, Lawrence, but please give us your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Yes, Bertha Goldenberg this morning did give me a setup for what I'm going to be talking about today. As you know, Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department is embarked on well over $5 billion in infrastructure investments over the course of the next decade. And I led a team in the last year and a half to basically plan the climate resilience elements of that overall program and take into account a variety of factors discussed here today. So the first thing I want to just acknowledge is that there's a very, very large multidisciplinary team involved with this. I don't even have half of the team members listed here, not only leadership within the Water and Sewer Department and the county, but the team that I led included climate scientists, stormwater engineers, wastewater engineers, coastal scientists, you name it, they're all involved. So it's a very, very multidisciplinary effort that gets involved with this sort of thing. And I think in terms of the folks here in attendance, that's reflected as well. So what were our overall objectives in pulling in climate resilience into this effort? Well, first of all, just understand the science. And it's not just about sea level rise. We were very, very concerned with the whole range of potential climate change impacts, including changes in precipitation and wind, and how all that relates to inundation with storm surge. We had to, as Robert was alluding to, understand the assets, their asset life and so forth, so we had to define what critical assets there are and what the risks are due to climate change, and develop design criteria so our design teams can use that in the planning of all this infrastructure going forward. So I'm going to very quickly touch on the projections that we used, not only in sea level rise, but in those other parameters, and how we went from those into developing design guidelines for our team. For the system. And I want to very briefly also touch on some next steps that we're doing where we're looking not only at some of these gray alternatives, quote-unquote hard alternatives, but also some greener solutions and how we're going to incorporate some of these refinements in the next steps. So first of all, planning for peak flows at the wastewater treatment facilities, both the pump stations and the wastewater plants. You have to not only look at population changes, as Bertha alluded to, we're doing that out to 2035, but you have to look at the changes of sea level rise impacting groundwater and therefore infiltration, and then also how rainfall is going to change and how that affects peak flows. So we did projections of rainfall all the way out to 2100 for different sea level rise time horizons, looking at the 2-year, 10-year, 100-year return intervals and how those might impact peak flows at the plant and at the different pump stations. Historically, their design criteria for peak flow is based on a 2-year storm, which using the Water Management District was a 4.5-inch storm. When you just take into account the most recent 15 years of record, that actually increased to approximately 4.9 inches. And if you do projections, depending on what point in the future you're looking at, 2040 out to 2100, that could be anywhere between a 5.4-inch and 6-inch of rainfall that you need to plan for. We also, just a quick aside, we used the USGS study that was completed last year and its impacts, showing its impacts of sea level rise on groundwater and how that would affect infiltration and inflow at each of the different wastewater pump stations. So just as an example of how peak rainfall impacts the flow at the plant, you see on the left-hand side different planning horizons, again, getting into right timing of your investments. Mechanical and electrical systems like pumps and so forth typically have a service life of 20, 25 years. So we are planning those more for the shorter term, 2040. The more critical systems, we look further out in time to 2075. So for instance, peak flows at this critical pump station 187, we decided after looking at the range of changes in rainfall to use the high end of the projections in 2040, which is a greenhouse gas scenario, RCP 8.5 and 90%. That's essentially 5.4 inches of rain. That's in and of itself a 20% increase from their current design criteria. When you run that through the collection system models, that actually resulted in an 11% increase in flows. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing to look at actual peak flow design for pump evaluations as part of this exercise. We also looked at critical flood impacts in terms of the 100-year storm. The 100-year storm is expected to increase from the current of approximately 14.5 inches in 24 hours to anywhere, depending on the greenhouse gas scenario, anywhere between 17 and 20 inches of rainfall for a 100-year storm event. That's just the rainfall component of potential flooding. So then, of course, we had to also look at sea level rise impacts. You all have seen this multiple times today. We decided to look at both 2040 and 2075, again, looking at a 25 or 50-year planning horizon for infrastructure. And we looked at both the NOAA high and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers high curve, which is essentially a 3 or 4 foot of sea level rise in 2075, which is what's summarized in this banner. And then we wanted to say, well, how does that actually combine with surge along the coast? We developed a Mike 21 model of the coastline. This shows how it's calibrated to Hurricane Andrew, being the red line tracks. And then we adjusted that track up and down the coast to see what is the worst case Hurricane Andrew that we might encounter, and then add sea level rise to that. So if you start out, this is the flooding that occurred back in 1992 associated with Hurricane Andrew. And you see on here, all the green dots are the critical wastewater pump stations that Bertha alluded to before. The red dots are their wastewater treatment plants. There's 3 of them along the coast, and they are planning a new wastewater treatment plant to the west. So we used all of these in evaluating the potential risk to the infrastructure. What happens when you add in rainfall and storm surge as it is today? It's slightly higher than what Hurricane Andrew experienced. And then when you actually add in future sea level rise, so this is 4 feet of sea level rise, plus the increase in rainfall, up to 20 inches of rainfall. We recognize that you probably don't get those things concurrently, but that was the decision made to look at them all together. There's an awful lot of potential flooding throughout the system. But as you can also see, it's not the same depth of flooding throughout the system. So it's important to recognize that as you evaluate potential hardening issues. So what did we consider? Different planning horizons. Robert alluded to this before. I've mentioned it a few times. But it's also important to understand the criticality of your infrastructure. At this first phase, we just considered for the wastewater treatment plants inside maintaining the facility hydraulics. So keeping wastewater flow moving through the plant, and then primary treatment, secondary treatment, and so forth. We're now in an evaluation for the pump stations of other criticality factors based on what they actually serve. We looked at different levels of protection. There's different levels of potential freeboard based on the Florida building code that were considered, and also just different factors of safety, which might take into account wave effects, king tide effects, and so forth. All these things were considered as part of the development of the design guidelines. This shows a cross-section schematically of one of their wastewater treatment plants. This is the Central District plant out on Virginia Key. And essentially what you're seeing in the green bar is the full elevation of the plant from the ground level all the way up to the top. And all the individual lines on here represent different infrastructure components. On the right-hand side, you see 2 different flood levels that we considered. One is 16 feet, one was 20.3 feet, representing those different levels of service that we might consider. We essentially said everything that falls below those potential flooding levels, what can we possibly do to protect them? We looked at a wide variety of potential alternatives, such as elevating equipment or flood-proofing the equipment, maybe even putting in submarine doors so the building could be watertight for a period of time, static barriers. All the stuff actually comes out of a project we did actually with Hazen in New York City, and similar measures being considered here in terms of the hard infrastructure solutions. We came up with costs for those. So for the lower end scenario, the cost for the 3 wastewater plants, $19 million. And for the higher scenarios, it was $78 million. So we presented that in a workshop to the WASD staff, and essentially made the decision that for existing infrastructure, where you're doing a retrofit, you would plan for the lower standards because the retrofits are always more costly and more challenging. But anything new would plan for that higher standard. Briefly, I want to touch on some of the next steps. We are doing a study right now with the Nature Conservancy looking at greener alternatives to protecting against flood control. We have 2 different demonstration projects, which we're just starting right now. One in Wagner Creek, where we're going to look at the conceptual planning of different alternatives, such as bank improvements, multiple green space, and flood control alternatives that might be considered to provide resilience to flooding in that particular area of Miami-Dade. And then for Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department, their South District plant, you see a picture of it here on the right. To the east of it, it's bordered by a lot of mangroves and wetlands. those actually could provide quite a bit of benefit to attenuate sea level rise plus storm surge. So we're going to do some modeling of what combinations of sea level rise and surge the existing mangroves and wetlands provide protection, and or if we provide additional expansion to that infrastructure, to extending the wetlands further out or higher up, how could we provide additional greener sort of approaches to protecting the plant. Last item, we are in the process now of refining the design guidelines for the wastewater pump stations. Before, we looked primarily at the year 100-year storms in the year 2075. Now we're going to actually dial back to more near-term sea level rise scenarios of 1.5 feet, which is approximately 2040, as well as, say, a 25-year design storm, and look at the different combinations of risk versus cost so we can have a more flexible approach depending on the context for the different standards. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I think it was very important to hear from your perspective working in the private sector, in many cases for public clients. Folks, we're going to have time for questions. I just have one that I'm going to, so start getting ready for the mics, if you like. Gentlemen, it occurred to me as I was listening and also thinking back through this morning, by design of the agenda, we've been focused on community infrastructure, community planning. Your projects are, in the most part, for the public. An aspect of what I know at the steering committee for the compact, and I think many of us are wondering, is how does this information get into the private sector decision making? I mean, when you or parts of your firm are interacting with the private sector and they're trying to go through some form of risk assessment, analysis, investment, rate of return, are we in the ballpark? Should we be preparing information in a slightly different way to influence those decisions, or at least to be sure that they're looking at the same kind of data and uncertainty that we are? I'm curious, and I think it would be helpful for us as we plan other workshops and as we move forward with our work. So if you don't mind just sharing anything that you think might be helpful in that regard.
I'll say that we, in our role, typically dealing with the public sector, I think we are often asked to work with them as private development, private enterprise projects are vetted and moved forward. And so I do think that through that mechanism, we have an excellent means of making sure that the information we're talking about here and trying to apply on our public sector projects is also getting integrated into those projects, and obviously we, through that same mechanism, have a means to help craft their regulations and their codes. Again, I think another way that we can help make sure that those get into the decision making on the private investment side.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that. I agree, and I think the involvement and education and awareness campaign for both public as well as various stakeholders throughout any major project or study, such as resilience, needs to happen throughout the entire process. And I can speak for Miami Beach in that they have been engaging those through various venues and various means to the community, to the stakeholders, to the development community, and continues to intends to ramp up that program. It is important that the information education the message is very clear and very strong, such that, when you look at some of these projections, I'm sure we can all agree, in some cases, they're quite frightening. And thinking about what, as an owner, as an investor, what their reaction might be to that, and ensuring them that actions are underway to mitigate those effects in the near term, and plans are being, prepared for longer term scenarios. And so, and understanding that the investment that's happening, the planning that's happening is to their benefit to ensure that the appropriate protection measures are in the works is very important as part of that message.
I agree with both the comments that were just made by my colleagues. The only thing I would add to it is, I work for a very large company that works in both the public and private sector. We have like 25,000 employees all over the world, and one of my jobs until last year was as our Deputy Director for Water Resources to basically mainstream climate resilience planning into everything we do. And believe me, if you're finding it hard to do at your local community level, it's hard to do at a big company level as well. And it requires repetition, education, outreach. You got to make sure everyone is considering it as part of their master planning and design work. And it's just an ongoing process. So mainstreaming climate resilience is critical.
Just one last thing to add to that, and thank you. I definitely agree with that. One of the elements that has been incorporated in the policymaking and development code changes in Miami Beach is, as was mentioned previously, is incorporating flexibility into the design to give developers and owners not only information and understanding, but also the tools they need to make decisions. With regards to the freeboard, there was, I did mention that there's a 1 foot minimum requirement that was passed. In addition to that, there's been additional variances built into that code change that allows them to go higher should they so choose, and the correct types of urban design development components that could be applied to ensure that that's done in a respectful way to the context.
Okay, I see some folks lining up, sir, and then we'll
Morning.
go over to Susie.
I guess my question for Jason is, we talk a lot about moving water. How are we moving people in this system? How are you getting your labor onto Miami Beach? How are you getting your tourists on Miami Beach when there's going to be this flooding issue?
As part of the vulnerability assessment that is underway now, it is a concern. It is something being considered, and the integration and the participation of all departments within the city is intent on addressing some of those issues with respect to the ability for access, not only within the community, but also to the mainland.
Thank you, Jim. I was hoping to put Jason on the spot just a little bit and see if he can go back to one of his slides, the one that was the chart, because I think it really kind of touches on something that Jennifer brought up this morning about how we need to start updating and changing our land use codes. And so as we went through the process of amending our land use and changing elevations, Jason created this, I think, a great chart that helped me communicate with a lot of the folks in the city, and it really helped communicate with a lot of elected officials. They were taking a very important step and making a very important decision. Changing elevation, there was concern, but this chart, and if you can just kind of walk through it, it really changed the conversation from, we're vulnerable and we're flooded and these things are happening, to we're actually doing these things and we're investing and we're reducing risk. And if you could just kind of walk through that, because I think it could be very helpful for a lot of cities when they're trying to convince their elected body to make some very difficult decisions. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Susie. And that is a good point. Working with the Blue Ribbon panel during the code review and recommendations of modifications, the questions kept coming up. What are the implications? What are the unintended consequences of these changes? How does it affect the historic context in those properties? How does it affect access? So it was a much bigger, more complex question than just, do we raise it 1 foot or 2? And the implications were intended to, if you can go back to the slide, were intended to help answer that question and show the value that these changes were offering. And of course, there's additional design criteria that can be developed to address the aesthetics and access and associated things. But to Susie's point, the recognition that likely higher amounts of freeboard in the near future are likely going to be required. But we had to start somewhere, and we have to move the needle towards enhancing resilience, providing protection for existing and future properties. And so thinking of it in terms of the right time, the right investment is an incremental change that is constantly monitoring the changing climate, changing conditions to ensure that we're advancing and continuing to provide value in the community. With the freeboard, the 1 additional foot, it's providing a difference from a 25-year storm to a 50-year storm with respect to inundation scenarios. So there's definite value there. And for many of the older homes that are at lower elevations and higher risk, even getting to that BFE or BFE plus 1 is a significant ask. And so there's a lot of detail that has to be worked out. But this is a way to look at that and help demonstrate value. If you look at the additional freeboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see that it continues to increase the amount of protection offered. Of course, there's incremental costs associated with that as well, but this is really a simple way to help communicate the value of those changes.
Anybody have another question? Take advantage of these guys, folks. Jennifer.
So I have a question that I think could be asked here or in a later session, but I'll present it now. I'm curious about when we see sizable projects that are being advanced in the region, that we suspect that they should be subject to a more robust review or complete review process. Do you think that the mechanism already exists today to provide for that kind of community level analysis of how the project fits into an overall plan? Or do you think that we are lacking the appropriate forum or say review committee of some sort that would allow for the type of review and early discussion about how that that project might be treated or considered or evaluated for all the various facets of infrastructure that are represented on that site or within that project for that kind of concurrency that we might talk about. So I'm just, again, wondering, does the forum exist, or do we need to start contemplating some additional structure that can aid us to ensure that we're not missing critical opportunities?
It's a loaded question, and since I'm not a politician, I probably shouldn't be answering. I guess all I'm going to say is that the discussion earlier about the legislation that's recently been passed that encourages adaptation action areas and building things into comprehensive plans is a step in the right direction. There definitely is a need for more regional planning. I think you were highlighting that earlier. I'm not sure there's teeth behind it right now. That would be my initial reaction. But having chief sustainability officers who've now been brought into different jurisdictions will definitely help us move in that direction to get that coordination within organizations, at least at a jurisdictional level.
I think we are moving in the right direction. Certainly, there's room for improvement with regard to that. I think the regionalization, I touched on it in the presentation. I think that there is much to be gained by having that kind of a mechanism, a forum in place. So we're probably not there yet, but I do think we're making strides.
And I'll just add that there's always opportunities to expand on outreach and education. I think for the City of Miami Beach, the Blue Ribbon Panel is a terrific venue to bring the public in, to bring key stakeholders, including the development community in, to be engaged in those conversations and understand the direction the community's going.
Yes, sir. Next question.
Yes, Mel Meinhardt. From your perspective nationally of your companies, what regions or groups of municipalities across the country should we look to as exemplars? Where's the best practice? Where do we go to find even small communities or regional cooperation that we could all be looking for as really getting it right, or at least heading aggressively in the right direction and early on? Thanks.
New York City comes to mind for me. I mean, you gave the example before. They unfortunately got forced into it a little bit by Hurricane Sandy, but they were already on that path, and they are very aggressively, have an overall resilience plan, not just for water, wastewater. It's across all infrastructure, across all sectors, and they have found most of the funding. I think they're looking at $19 billion in resilience investments. So that would be the first one that comes to mind. They're certainly not the only ones.
So I'm not going to be bashful. I'm going to say welcome to Southeast Florida. You are actually in a region that is probably doing more on these issues than any place in the country. I just returned Monday from speaking at the National Hazards Conference, which is an annual conference in Denver. And I didn't see anything or hear anything that would lead me to believe that we're not very close to the cutting edge on a lot of difficult issues. The most important thing is that we have the kind of peer cooperation going on, and we're trying to expand on that. So I hear more people coming and asking what we're doing, and that's why we're so, I think, intent on trying to share it in these kinds of venues and find and get feedback on how we can do that in a more efficient way. Next question.
My question is, has Mount Everest lost 1 foot in elevation in the last 100 years? And I ask this because I'm confused as a novice in this area. It was just as kind of a comment. I wish that there was a drawing that showed sea level. What is, you know, when you say that something is 1 foot above sea level, is that today's sea level or 1900 sea level? I don't know, right? And so where is it now in relationship to things? Where is groundwater in South Florida? When you say it's going to rise up, does that mean I'm going to kick it? You know, it's going to come up and get my shoes wet sometime? And then what is the relationship between that and how the water gets into the canals and goes somewhere? And I guess it's just kind of, I wish there was that diagram that kind of explained that kind of what water does and where water is when you talk about it, because it's just a little confusing. So I apologize. This is all great, but that little attribute is a little confusing. So.
Well, I think this morning the example, the datum, I mean, you have to have some perspective on what you're measuring it by. So the little exercise we did earlier, I think, was a good. You've got to understand what datum you're talking about, and then all things are relative to that datum. So.
Just one clarification. I mean, if you look at the fine print, all sea level rise terminology is usually given as relative sea level rise, because ground surface sometimes is dropping in some parts of the country. In some parts of the country, it's actually going up based on tectonic effects. Around here, it's dropping slightly from what I heard, but it's more or less level. You go to the Gulf Coast or up into the Chesapeake Bay region, it's dropping dramatically. So relative sea level rise is tied to that datum, which is critical.
Question over here.
Yes, just a quick question. In trying to get the private industries to incorporate resiliency into their design, are there resources that provide kind of the elevations for the sewer systems, the electricity, all the infrastructure that is feeding them? Because in asking them to incorporate it in their design, they need to know the parameters in which, they need to be designing for, what's feeding the buildings. Is that available?
Currently, just the FEMA information is available online, but we just met yesterday in the Water and Sewer Department in Miami-Dade about a vision for getting all the GIS data of potential flood elevations available, so people could do exactly what you're saying. But it's not quite there yet, but within the next year, that's the plan.
We haven't focused today on our public and private universities, but they were involved in many cases on the technical team, and they're involved in many ways on the work that the compact does. There's something called the Florida Climate Institute, which you can Google up and see. But I would Florida Atlantic, Florida International, University of Miami, University of Florida, which is here in the region. They all have a lot of capability and capacity also to help. Okay, looks like we are. Should we wind up, or can I let these gentlemen make any passing final comments? Got enough time? Okay. You want anything that you want to leave our audience with, or final comments? Go ahead, Lawrence.
I guess the one thing I'd like to add is when evaluating the investments that are required to build resilience, a useful analysis to consider is the cost of no action. Essentially, what damages would occur if we did nothing. And the only reason I bring this up is the New York City example I gave earlier. They actually did something very interesting. In addition to coming up with the costs that they needed to invest in their wastewater systems to protect them, I think this is on the order of $315 million. They also, in order to evaluate different levels of protection, as Jason's alluded to, came up with what is the cost if they did nothing in the year 2050 for that level sea level rise. And if I remember correctly, the number they came up for 2050 plus 1.5 foot of sea level rise was between $1 and $2.6 billion. So 315 million might have seemed like a huge number to invest, but when you look at the cost of no action, it becomes a very strong imperative to act. So.
And I recall those same numbers, the 315 to save over $1 billion. So I gave most of my parting thoughts in my final slide. I think that as we are, all of those that were proactive, that were innovative, that we're collaborative, and that we stick to it. I believe that we certainly can, will achieve and maintain resiliency. And I guess the other thing that I would add to that is to give one more plug for the idea that regionalization will give us the most optimal solutions. And so I think all of us have some part in trying to make that happen, and encourage you all to strive for that.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. And maybe one last thought to add is just I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting all the stakeholders at the table, whether it's within a city or a county, all the different departments. As was stated previously, the urban designers, the landscape architects, in addition to the engineers. Not all solutions will be hard or engineering driven, and the ability to integrate innovation and a different way of thinking really can come out of that collaborative, integrated process, including the universities and regional collaboration as well. So definitely, focus on pulling those key members together and looking for what haven't we asked, what haven't we thought of. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. We're very fortunate to have large companies represented here and regionally based companies that are here to be part of the teams that we work with on these issues. And please join me in appreciating this panel.